Good morning for another entry of Snow Cone Diaries. I want to talk a little bit today about history, um, mainly ancient history from an academic perspective. It's kind of the category that you look into sort of prehistorical civilization development, more or less, between, let's say, 40,000, 30,000 years before Christ into, 500 AD, give or take, really into the first millennium BCE, but sort of that category of history in terms of how the civilization that we live in today evolved and came to be. I talked a little bit about last time about karma and dharma and this idea of action. Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna and Krishna, you must act in this world, and act with nobility and with the right intent and with pride and with honor, and kind of let the chips fall as they may, even if that means that you need to murder your cousins, more or less. Cannot escape the karma. And dharma with duty, which is wrapped up in a lot of those conversations from the Bhagavad Gita with respect to Arjuna's duty as a warrior, effectively, in the different caste systems that were developed around that for various reasons. I'm not condoning that system. I'm just saying that that's the context within which those discussions were had between Arjuna and Krishna. This idea of action and duty, and really sits at the very heart of Western philosophy in terms of this concept of arete, and back in ancient Greece, excellence. Plato and Aristotle write about it a lot as it relates to generally the pursuit of the good, you might say, and how that lines up with the divine, ultimately. And so that's a very, very important concept that sort of rests at the very heart of, what I called Eurasian philosophy, which covers that Northern Africa, Mediterranean, Near East, Indian subcontinent, and then the Far East and China. The Lao Tzu talks about the way. It's the same sort of idea that, despite the chaos of the world, there is a divine order. And, your task as a man, ultimately, most of the philosophical systems were designed around that sort of masculine concept, but there's no reason why it can't transfer to the female persuasion. That, in fact, your duty was to behave in a noble and honorable way, as Confucius or Lao Tzu would teach you, or as Plato or Aristotle would teach you, or as Shankara, Patanjali would teach you, or as Buddha would teach you, or as Jesus would teach you. It's the same teaching all across the board. And there's something to be said for that in terms of the extent and influence of this idea as it relates to karma and dharma, specifically out of that, Vedic tradition that emerges out of the Indian subcontinent, which is how I was effectively trained, right? I've spoken a little bit about this before. I was trained by monks of the Ramakrishna order in the Upper East Side of Manhattan for many years. Studied with them, was initiated with the head Swamiji there, Swami Adeswarananda, a respectable author and academic himself, among, spiritual giant, really, coming from the tradition of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. That's how I was taught, and the tradition from which I am beholden to a certain extent. Also have an undergraduate degree in ancient studies from Brown University. So my undergraduate thesis was around Hermeticism, which was a synthetic theophilosophical doctrine that emerges out of Ptolemaic Egypt. Okay, so I've been studying this stuff for a long time. I've written a couple of books about it. Have a good handle and grasp of how all these things emerged and what ideas they were drawing from, and some insight into why some of the systems that emerged are so similar, in a nutshell. And that's really what Theology Reconsidered is about, the first sort of real academic book that I wrote. And that exercise in discovery was originated from a identification of the similarity of some very ancient symbols. And I wasn't going to go here today, but you know what? I'm going to do it anyway because it's really freaking cool. Everybody likes pictures, right? So I'm going to minimize this, and I think that you guys can see this. Let's close my messages. So ultimately, from a Pythagorean standpoint, okay, we look at the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4. This is called the tetractys, and this is from a theophilosophical standpoint, what some of these symbols really have come to, how we've come to understand them and what they mean. Pythagoras very much was influenced by music and harmony and measure and proportion. The golden phi ratio and the Fibonacci series are all stem and emerge out of this pattern, okay? He discovered this and he lost his life, okay, teaching this, okay? Not the first, nor will he be the last. To the east, we find something like this, okay? Which is the Wuji, Taiji, the yin yang, the emergence of the cosmic order, and then the original yin and yang, the male and the female, to come together to form a series of symbols from which an entire metaphysical structure is constructed. Greater yin, lesser yang, greater yang, and then these are the primary 8 bagua, they call symbols or trigrams, from which the order is kept and maintained in the universe. There's 2 arrangements of these, an earlier and then a later bagua arrangement, okay? And you could see that the arrangements themselves, they have metaphysical principles, and there are certain dynamics to this sort of hexagonal or really eight-sided structure, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, okay? Earlier heaven and later, and I've written extensively about this on my blog, Snow Cone Diaries. You can see that, and I recommend you, if you have further interest in these topics, if they are of interest to you and they're fascinating, you should look at them. There's also a transposition of these the basic 64 hexagrams, which are 6 layers of symbols, okay, from which the I Ching is formed, okay? The I Ching is probably the oldest philosophical document from the Far East, and it's still used to this day as a divination tool, a tool that's consulted for advice. And there's a ritual of yarrow stalks that you can sort of lay out in place, and you sort of build the symbols, and you can get, once you propose a question through the priest, you get a sense of, it's basically like a tarot card reading, except it's much more sophisticated than that. These symbols, by the way, emerged from older symbols, Lushu and the He-Tu diagrams, which are supposedly mythologically were emerged out of, on turtle shells, which are very famous back in very ancient Chinese antiquity. And you can see here this sort of spiral Fibonacci sequence that emerges here, the 1, the 2, it switches from the light to the dark, 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, and then 5, and then it goes on into sort of a spiral-based figure. And this symbol is similar, but somewhat different as the spiral based in it. But they both ultimately are merged into this I Ching and sort of hexagram bagua based structure from which the I Ching emerges as sort of a later philosophical development in the first millennium BCE, along with Plato and Aristotle and all of really the Upanishads that all really emerged within 100 to 200 years of each other. You can see the yin yang philosophical components here that this, in fact, you can sort of see it emerge from and I think this is the He-Tu diagram. And then you can see the yin yang, how it sort of emerges and is very much related to these other really very ancient Chinese symbols. This is the He-Tu. In this depiction, you can sort of see the geometric symmetry that's embedded in the document. And so my original question was, how are these symbols related? And ultimately, if I could understand how they're related, I could understand Eurasian metaphysics, more or less. The Theology Reconsidered, that work emerges out of that question. I wrote a paper, and then the book emerges. And then ultimately, the question is really answered in Homo Mysticus, which is a much more sort of esoteric, mystical treatise that looks at these concepts from a much more kind of symbolic perspective. Long story short, both of these numerical and metaphysical structures emerge and are understood through the geometric foundations of the cosmos, ultimately, that are related to physics, okay, and fundamental to the world that we live in. But they're fundamental at multiple dimensions and layers. So they're fundamental at the realm of physics when we look at relativity, when we look at quantum theory, when we look at Newtonian mechanics, when we look at fluid dynamics. All of these systems, these very sophisticated systems, mathematically based, are, come from and emerge out of some of these very core geometric and numerical truths, and there's this whole idea that mathematics is the language of God, and that, numbers are sort of co-eternal with the universal structure and universal cosmic, order. And there's something to be said for that, because we sort of find them everywhere. But what must be understood, and this relates to some of our other discussions relative to the nature of the body and the spirit and how they're related, that these truths have layers of dimensional reality. So yes, they are true from a physics standpoint, but also these symbols are true and permeate through and reflect and construct these other sort of higher order dimensional realities as well that we see in the dream world, and certainly well beyond that, some of the states that are described in some of the Eastern philosophical systems. So these structures are there, they're just a little bit more fluid, and they apply to different principles. But as you try and understand how to live, okay, which was basically the philosophical problem, how to organize society and how to live. This is what all of these ancient civilizations were trying to do. You understanding the geometric and numerological structure of the cosmos gives you a better chance of trying to understand how you can live in harmony with it. Okay, and this goes into my whole idea of harmony of the spheres and the different sort of layers of relationships and dimensions that you effectively live in, not only from an interdimensional standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint, but just practically speaking on Earth, as we look at the individual struggle, how you take care of yourself, how you work through your family issues, through your social issues, and then you've got society at large, and then you got humanity, and then you have the Earth, and then you have the cosmos. You have sort of all of these layers that you are a part of. And so, as we tie that back into what does it mean to live an excellent life, to be noble, to be good, it's, effectively to harmonize your life within the context of this whole structure that you're part of, that you're integrated into. And that's where, this idea of karma and dharma comes into play. The ignoring and making that go away because you think this world isn't real is just not only not productive, it's counterproductive. The task at hand is to correct and optimize and tune the world that we live in. That's why we're embodied to do that. We are not embodied to, to seek pleasure necessarily, or to a certain extent, one sort of comes out of the other, right? To take care of the business and build a structure that we all can kind of live harmoniously through. And so the world that we have here and its unique nature can be preserved, right? So that's sort of the idea. Certainly as we look at harmony of the spheres, which is something that I talk a little bit about in Homo Mysticus. So I'm going to leave these pictures up, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about history. So the historical aspect of civilization as we come to understand it through the written records that we see in ancient Sumer in 3000 BCE or so, and that emerged over the next 2000 years in various cultures in the Middle East, the Near East, the Far East, and certainly the Mediterranean and Northern Africa, as we sort of understand how those civilizations emerged based on the written record. All of them have a common component of ancient wisdom from which these societies merge, whether it's Hermes or Thoth or Fuzi in the ancient Chinese structure, or the Rishis in the Vedic structure. They all speak to these sort of god men from which the basic components of civilization are given. The basic, they're learned, they're taught. Okay. And you can see it certainly in the Judeo-Christian tradition as well, right? The idea of Moses and Noah, Abraham, that whole tradition as well, the Zoroastrian tradition as well, Zarathustra and the Avesta, they all kind of speak to an ancient wisdom tradition, okay? And it's sort of, you sort of blend that far back into myth, right? Into these sort of Homeric legends, or the Vedic lore, or the Mahabharata, the sort of ancient stories, right? They're legends. Troy, the fall of Troy, they're very old stories. But, how much truth is there in them? And then as you peel back the onion a little bit further, you have this legend that continues to persist about Atlantis, this very advanced civilization that was destroyed in a manner and a fashion consistent to what, we see in Old Testament, biblical times. So this idea that we as a people had evolved, and then in turn we had misused our power, and then were sort of thrust back into a more primitive state, right? This sort of cycle of growth and then destruction and then emergence, right? You see that a lot in Dolores Cannon's work of the spiral, sort of time moving, not necessarily linearly, but as a spiral in cycles. And this notion that we're in sort of a very important part of the cycle now, as we try and kind of emerge out of a very materialistic last couple of 100 years, where effectively we almost destroyed ourselves, right, with nuclear weapons. So what can we learn from our history, more or less, right? What's back there? What's true and what isn't true? There's a lot of, there's certainly enough archaeological evidence to indicate that there may have been an advanced civilization, whether it's Gobel Tepe or whether it's the pyramids, some very structures that sit very deep in ancient history that were constructed in a way that we just don't fully understand. And there are some astrological alignments in there, particularly with pyramids, that seem to indicate that, they were erected a long time ago. There's pyramid structures really all over the place. And you have to combine the archaeological, the written, the genealogical, the Human Genome Project, and this emergence of modern man out of Africa around 75,000 years ago, from which we all descend, okay? And you have to sort of map that to, the geological and astrological evidence too. There seems to be a younger and older Dryas period where there was a massive kind of melting and shifting of water levels around 11 or 12,000 years ago. Some sort of cataclysmic type of event, which they speak to in terms of the destruction of Atlantis. And Dolores Cannon and many other, folks that claim to have channeled knowledge about the existence of Atlantis and how it was destroyed. And why it was destroyed. Dolores Cannon has some very specific information about that. And so this sort of esoteric wisdom tradition has emerged, which tries to capture and preserve some of that historical knowledge, right? Because, without the understanding of what happened before, are we not just destined to repeat our fate? Make the same mistakes over and over again? Isn't that why we're here, more or less? To try to grow and to evolve? I mean, isn't Darwin's theory of natural selection based upon that principle? There's an evolution of the physical form to reflect and live and coexist with the natural environment. There's a sort of a very naturalistic type of philosophy behind that, which is not incongruent with ideas of sort of cosmic intelligence, right? It's sort of built into the system. They're kind of emergent properties, you might call them. That's what we call them in systems. You know, as systems develop and get more sophisticated, there's certain properties that emerge that aren't necessarily specifically designed into the system. And we sort of see that in the natural world as well. So we'll close a little bit about, you know, Nostradamus and some of his warnings specifically, as you know, as we see from the quatrains, and then we see from the exposition of those quatrains in the work with Dolores Cannon, we can see some of the warnings about hitting that next cycle of potential evolution, which also has, you know, great potential for destruction as well. This idea of Bardo, where you have sort of these moments in your life and also in social life and humanity where there's such potential for growth. You can, you know, transition yourself into a whole, you know, catapult yourself into a whole new way of being, whole new way of existing, or you could pull back and revert back. And this idea of, you know, the cyclical aspects of history, of this nature of the soul, it's a different way of looking at spiritual growth. And you can see that actually sort of embedded in these ancient symbols, okay? This sort of cycle, you can see this in the He2 diagram. You know, it's buried in here. It's a very, very ancient way of thinking, okay? And you can see it here in the little shoe too, okay? And more of sort of a numerological transposition. So, you know, this different way of looking at history, in order for us to evolve, we need to understand what the prior state looked like and how we got there. And that's why history is so important. And in many respects, our history is very limited, and our notion of truth and science needs to be extended to support these ideas that reach further back into history, that draw from sources that are not necessarily of the physical plane, even though we can find remnants, whether it's ancient cave art, you know, that we see 40,000, 30,000 years ago across Eurasia, and or some of the ancient symbols that we find that sort of sit at the heart of the civilizations as we know them today that emerged, right? So we need to come to a better understanding of how those ancient people thought and what their heritage was and what their stories were, what their myths were, and, you know, what the relationship of that narrative was to truth. You know, we need to extend that idea so that we can fully understand how we have come to be, so we can fully understand what our potential is. So I think that covers most of what I wanted to cover today. And we've also shown you a bunch of pictures. So that's terribly exciting. Everyone have a great day. It is, by the way, Monday, October 11th. It is Columbus Day. We're not going to say that because that's when it's, you know, the old world, new world, colonialism. We're not going to get into that, but it is Columbus Day. Anyway, peace.